The John Smith Centre exists to make the positive case for politics and public service. And we try and do that in three key ways. Through research, we study the relationship between the public and their politicians. Through our various internship and development programmes designed to break down the barriers that too many people still face accessing public life. And through advocacy with events like these. For those joining for the first time, let me explain that our Power Hour series is designed to take a different aspect of power in each event and seek to explore it with a guest who's really excelling in their field. Recent guests have included Resolution Foundation Director Torsten Bell, the Shadow Secretary of State for International Development Preet Gill, and the former Change UK and Tory MP Anna Soubry. This is our 11th Power Hour event, and astonishingly, that's one for every Paralympic gold medal that our guest today has in her trophy cabinet. We are beyond thrilled to welcome Baroness Tanni Grey-Thompson to the John Smith Centre.
Thank
Tanni
you.
was appointed to the House of Lords as a crossbench peer in 2010, where she continued her work on disability rights and welfare reform. She's also undertaken a fascinating review of the duty of care in sport, which we'll explore with her this afternoon. If you're watching this event live, you can participate at any time by writing a question in the Q&A box at the foot of your screen. That will come through to the team here at the John Smith Centre, and I'll combine them with those submitted in advance, fielding as many as I possibly can to Tanni over the next 60 minutes. All of our Power Hour events are recorded and available to watch again on the John Smith Centre website. If you've joined our events before, you'll know that we like to start by getting to know our guests a bit better before discussing their working lives and finally their hopes and fears for the future. So please do shape the conversation by posing your questions in the Q&A box below. So welcome, Tanni. Kick us off. Tell us, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, the first thing I wanted to do was play rugby for Wales. And I grew up in a very, very sporty family in Cardiff, and where our obsession with rugby transcended everything else. So I do remember being in a supermarket with my mum when we were young and her asking where the apples had come from. And it was all the time of apartheid and things like that. And you know, obviously we also grew up in quite a political family. But this young man in the supermarket saying, oh, is it because of the apartheid? And my mum went, yes, of course, but it's also for the rugby. So my mum had this very strange view of what we were allowed to buy. So in terms of apartheid, and not buying anything from any rugby nation that was quite good. So that's the environment I grew up in. So rugby was the first. And I remember having a conversation with my mum where, you know, she was saying, you know, I'd never play rugby for Wales. And it was like, it's because I'm in a wheelchair. And she's like, no, because you're a woman. Because at that point, women weren't allowed to play rugby because it was too dangerous for our poor, gentle creatures that we are. And then so the next kind of serious thing I wanted to be was actually a lawyer. And the plan always was, you know, I got distracted by sport for quite a few years. I actually did a politics degree at university, but the plan always was when I retired to do law conversion and become a lawyer. And then because of lots of things I did while I was competing, and then I had the opportunity, I relatively soon after I retired to go to the House of Lords. I never quite did my law conversion. So in kind of some ways, I'm sort of in a slightly different version of where I thought I'd be. So rather than arguing about the law, I argue about making it. And I'm not sure I want to do my law conversion now. But it's kind of, politics law was kind of always it for me. I just got diverted for a bit.
You say that you came from quite a political family. Is that what lit your kind of passion for politics, your family, or is it a wider set of circumstances?
A lot of it was my personal experience. And so we talked about political things. I don't remember my parents ever telling me about how they voted. I do remember my dad absolutely going ballistic with me once because I voted for the Monster Raven Looney Party. And he absolutely, and for me it was a protest vote because I grew up in a household where my grandmother was quite old when she had my mum. My grandmother was born in 1900, so she grew up without the right to vote. So she used to tell me all the time, it's like, well, however, you've got to vote, you have to vote, you have to use your right to vote. You know, I remember Dad going mad with me for that. But the personal circumstance was that, you know, as a disabled child, I had no automatic right to mainstream education. You know, I grew up in a world where I was kind of othered and excluded, and you know, people would look at me like I was 5 years old when the first person stopped me in the street and asked me why my mother hadn't aborted me. So I didn't know what the word abortion meant. So having this conversation with my mum about abortion at 5. And so there was all these things that happened. But it was actually when I was 10 when I'd gone to mainstream school, because when I entered school in my first year, I could walk a little bit. I was born with spina bifida. But then very gradually my spine collapsed and it severed my exposed spinal cord and paralysed me. So I just grew up thinking I had this, I was going to go to the same high school that my sister was at. And we then got a letter from the head teacher when I was 10 saying, we don't take people like Tanni. And then, I was lucky my parents were educated. They knew how to write letters. And my dad, the upshot of it, basically threatened to sue the Secretary of State for Wales over my right to go to a mainstream school using work that Baroness had done. And so that was my kind of first exposure to white papers, green papers, and my dad telling me I needed to read them and understand them, and didn't realise my life would then end up, being dictated by them. But so there were lots of very personal things. And then through my time in sport, my dad was very much, you have a very privileged life, you have the chance to do things that so many people don't, then you need to kind of pay back, and that sense of kind of responsibility and not speaking for other people, because I think that's not great, but using the platform you have. And I think there's also an element of, if I can be really successful as an athlete, then that will give me a platform. So I was very keen that when I was competing, I didn't have a very public view on a lot of things, but that doesn't mean to say I have a view on everything. And actually a lot of it shouldn't be public. I think that's a really important lesson they teach you when you first go into the Lords is, learn when to shut up and learn when to have a public opinion on things. So it was always there, but it was just finding like the platform to do it. And, and then through my time, in my early years as an athlete, lots of disability rights campaigners didn't like Paralympians because, we don't show a representative view of disability. And that's still true, and I feel really strongly about that, same as Olympian doesn't show a representative view of any kind of humanity, because you have to be good at sport and train, and you have to have all these things that, doesn't exist in everybody. So I think where it's been interesting, my journey through all this is that, and especially with 2012 was an amazing Olympics and Paralympics. It was stunning. But if I hear one more non-disabled person tell me it changed the world for disabled people, I'm just going to scream I'm not going to do my polite reply anymore. I'm just going to scream at them. Because if anyone stood up and said 2012 changed the world for Black people or for women or for people around, would go, yeah, you're having a laugh, don't be stupid. But individuals saying 2012 changed the world for disabled people just gets nodded through. And it didn't. It was amazing. It was an incredible sporting event. But we're dealing compulsory do not resuscitate orders being placed on disabled people during the pandemic, that you're 6 times more likely to die of COVID if you've got a learning disability, and and universal credit, and it's like and yeah. So for me, there's so many things that we have to try and change.
There's a lot in that I want to unpack with you, and just hearing you talk about 2012 and the Paralympics, it reminds me of those Channel 4 adverts around, Superhuman, and how disabled people were kind of presented, particularly in the context of elite sport. And we will get to that in the next half an hour or so. But if I can take you back to that, age of 10, you're fighting for mainstream schooling. You're surrounded by a lot of kind of pressure there to be fighting for basic rights, really. And at the same time, though, you're already excelling in sport. And having read some of the things that have been written about your life, you always had that balance between your education and what you were doing as sport. How did you manage to maintain that? Because, that's often, something people are competing with to this day, whether you can do both at such a young age.
Yeah, so I'm just moving my light. Sorry, there we go. Yeah, it wasn't always easy, but through actually my Paralympic career, there is no money in Paralympic sport. So people assume that a successful Paralympic athlete's made a fortune. That's just not true. I made enough money, and with a lot of help from my parents, which I was very lucky to have, and some sort of friends and things. I made enough money every year to do the next year, but not really a lot more than that, to be honest, through most of my career. And so when I was quite young, my dad saying to me, so when I decided I wanted to be an athlete, my dad was like, well, well, to do that, you need a really good job. And to do that, you really, have to have a good education. And Dad always used to say, education gives you choices. So as a child, I'd be like, this is so boring. But recognizing that education is the opening to so many things. And sort of all through my career, on and off, I worked and did other stuff and built up different skills, because also you're a long time retired from being in sport. So the education was huge. And also I'd been taken to visit the special school that the Education Authority wanted to send me to. And the children there were being occupied. They weren't doing lessons. You could do English language, you could do home economics. Actually, I ended up doing home economics O-level, but you were given really limited. You couldn't do sciences. You could barely do math. You were just shut off from the age of 11 without even having the chance to try for it. So I remember going to the school and thinking, I can't be here. I can't, because if I don't get education at that point, I'm stuffed. So my parents were always really open about having quite adult conversations with me, even when I was pretty young, about those things. And I think that was really good. And I mean, for me, the bizarre twist was amazing. But 30 years on from my parents' fight, and using Baroness Warnock's legislation, I'm actually sitting in the House of Lords in a debate tabled by her to recognise, the amazing work that she did. And I got to sit in the chamber and say, because of you, wow, I am here. No, she kind of looked at me and just went, all right. And I was like, oh, okay, that's fine. But I recognise from being really young, I was lucky I had parents who were willing to take on the fight, who had the capacity. I was recently having a tidy up and found all my dad's letters, and they're fab. They're brilliant.
Oh, wow. Will you publish those one day?
Yeah, I should do, actually. I mean, because he didn't give up, and it's quite hard in terms of people making judgments on me as it's, my parents were told, because I was disabled, I'd never get a job, I'd never get married, I'd never. And they were just like, don't care. And some of that was also, I've got an older sister. I think and we had this conversation again when I was quite young. They didn't see it as my sister's responsibility to care for me, and so, independent living, all those things were very much part of the conversations that we had. And it was only much later, my dad actually died 10 years ago, just after he saw me going to the Lords, which was lovely. But there was a time when I was about 7 and he showed me this book. He was an architect. He had this book and it was the Taj Mahal and the Sydney Opera House and all these places. And he told me the world was an amazing place and I needed to travel and I needed to, do something. And through my time in sport and beyond, I kind of ticked off all the places in the book, and it was like, and I had this conversation. We knew we didn't have much time left, and I sort of wanted to say thank you to him. And I said to him, do you remember that conversation when I started using a wheelchair when I was 7 and you told me the world was an amazing place? And he was like, no. Okay, right, great. And eventually he came back and he went, oh yeah, your mum and I had been chatting and we were just absolutely adamant you were not going to live with us forever because you were quite an annoying child. And it's like, oh, right. So it's probably a good job that I took what I did from the conversation that we had rather than an annoying child. But my parents were they were amazing in terms of that support. And then growing up, you realise that not every child has that.
Yeah. So you go to university and you study politics, I think.
Yeah.
But whilst you're very politically active around campaigning for rights, I don't think you're ever aligned with a particular political party. Really at any point in your life. For a lot of people who are political in their youth, that's unusual. Is there anything behind that? There wasn't a natural party for you?
No, for me, I sort of drifted around quite a lot as well. I think I'm very issue driven.
Yeah.
And I think depending what the issue is, depends whether I'm a bit left, a bit right, a bit further both ways. So I never found sort of a natural political home for me, to be honest. And then some things, I guess, that parties told me I should be interested in, I wasn't. Or, there are, and that's evolved as I've grown up and matured, absolutely. But, some of the things that might have been big issues of the day when I was 17, 18 weren't issues to me.
Yeah.
So, no, I've struggled. And I think you know, the Lords comes in for a lot of criticism for many, many reasons, you know, and most of it's as being nominated, not elected. But actually it is a place where if you don't have this natural political home, you can fit in. Yeah. And I have to say, what I think sometimes is really strange, because there are people that I kind of agree with more than others generally. But then there's sometimes, and obviously not like now because we're not in the building, but there's sometimes when a vote comes through and you walk through the lobby and you go, really? Oh, okay. That and it's always interesting to have that moment where you find yourself agreeing with people that you didn't think you would. Yeah. And the other thing with the Lords, which is amazing, is you can really agree with someone on this issue, and then you can really disagree with someone on the other issue, but it's quite a grown-up place. Yeah. To have those differences, that you don't, you know, it's not, you don't take the one line all the time. But
can you talk to us about what it was like being approached? So I think it's February 2010, and does Gordon Brown phone you and say, hey Tanni, do you fancy joining the House of Lords, or is that not quite how it works?
No, so I'm a crossbencher, so as a crossbencher there's an independent process.
Okay.
And I was nominated, and then I got a phone call saying, would you fill in a CV? I was like, okay. And then I got invited for an interview, which was just, I mean, it was brutal.
Who interviews you?
So there's an independent appointments commission. So I was interviewed by 5 people. One of the questions they asked me was, what is the most interesting debate you've listened to in the House of Lords?
Right. Yeah.
And I can't remember what I said as an answer, but half my interview panel laughed. I think I said something like, they all are.
Yeah.
And then there's a bit when you're embedded in it. I mean, there are lots of debates are really interesting, but also what we do is very technical. You know, so if it's not your area of specialty, sometimes, you know, the debates can be quite hard to follow. But if it's the thing you care about, you know, because you get this massive range of views in each debate. So yeah, I didn't hear anything for a little while, and I actually got a text message, so which said, you know, congratulations on Friday, it'll be announced during the House of Lords. I was
like, that's amazing.
So yeah, I remember ringing my husband's a Republican in terms of that he doesn't believe in a nominated second chamber, and slightly wider than that. So he said, you know, come the revolution, you know, you're on my list. My dad said to me, well, it's still not a proper job, because he didn't think sport was a real job. And he said, well, it's still not a proper job, is it? And my daughter, who was 6 at the time, I obviously did a really bad job of explaining to her, because she told her teacher I had a job collecting tickets at Westminster Tube Station. And you go, great. But my family were amazing. But, you know, it was, I remember picking her up from school, and she'd said, can I tell my teacher? And her teacher was like, well done on your new job, but it's a shame it's got to be in London. But if you work really hard, you can get promoted back to Darlington, which is the nearest mainline train station to where I live. And I can't do it in Darlington. She went, well, you're always telling the kids to aim high and be positive and work really hard and not give up. And it's like, and that's when I found out what Karis had told the teacher. But
so you become a crossbench peer in the House of Lords. But I think a lot of people would think when you join the House of Lords and you represent a political party, there's an automatic support network there for you. There's a whip, there's somebody to organise what committees you might be involved in, what work you might do. And I am guessing that as a crossbencher, it might be quite lonely, unless, of course, you organise collectively as crossbenchers. Can you talk to us a bit about how that works in practice?
Yeah, so we have a convener who we elect. And it's interesting because we do have, you know, a weekly meeting to discuss legislation that's coming up, that various peers, both government and opposition, come and speak to us about, you know, what they're trying to do. The only challenge with the crossbenchers is we have this massive diversity of opinion within each bit of legislation, you know, so we don't collect, we're not whipped, we're not told how to vote. But I think what's really interesting about the whole of the Lords is that people are generally pretty supportive from all parties. So, you know, if you go and ask somebody about how a debate went, or who did you think made a good speech, people will be really open about that was a good speech, you know, that wasn't such good, you know. One of my first amendments in the welfare reform bill, I had a government peer help me rewrite it to make it better, and then said to me, of course, if you take it to a division, I won't vote with you. Yeah.
Wow.
And I remember that point going, And he said, well, it's one of your First Amendments. I'm helping you. Okay. Which
the tone is different in the House of Lords, is it not? In contrast to the House of Commons, it does seem more mild-mannered. Is that fair, or are there moments when it's as sort of testy as the other chamber?
I don't think it ever gets as testy as the Commons, but also because we're self-regulating. If you're rude in the chamber to somebody, the chamber sort of, and it's really difficult to explain it, the chamber kind of just shuts you down a bit. So we can get someone to stop speaking, but it's a real sort of, final straw. You can stand up and say, it's something like, I beg that the noble peer sits down. That's a really, really, it's only happened once in the 10 years that I remember being there. But we have rules. You can't point, you can't shout, you have to call people by their titles. So by the time you remember the title, it doesn't work at our end to be shouting. It doesn't get you heard. What gets you heard is having a really strong, good, sensible argument and debate. And so for me, I find it a very comfortable place to be. I mean, that's not to say sometimes you go in and, we do debate controversial issues and some are difficult, and people like you or hate you for what you say and do. If you're doing things they think is good, they like you. But we get a reasonable amount, nowhere near what the Commons gets, but female peers do get a reasonable amount of emails telling us that we're stupid and we don't know what we're talking about.
We might come on to the nature of abuse in politics more generally towards the end of the session, but given your crossbench status, I'm guessing lots of lobbying organisations and groups therefore automatically assume that your vote is up for grabs because they can't naturally decide what side of a debate you're going to fall down on. Does that mean that you get very heavily lobbied all of the time? What sort of organisations are sort of demanding your attention and your vote?
Well, we get briefing documents from everybody, but I think everyone in the Lords does, and then it's your choice whether you choose to engage with the group or not. And I would say I'm quite careful about lobbying groups. And there's a definition between campaign groups in my head anyway. So, I try to listen to all sides of the argument, because, you can go into a debate thinking, this is my view, but unless you listen to that diversity of opinion, it's really important, I think, to challenge yourself on what you think. And my opinion over time has changed. What I think now over things is not what I thought a year ago. So I think what you're allowed to do in the Lords is change your mind. It gives you that space to do it. And a number of times in debates, a peer will stand up and say, well, I thought this, but actually after listening to the debate, I think this. And so I do think you have that space to be able to do that. But you have to pick what you do. We don't have any staff. Yeah. So I do have somebody that helps me with my diary, but I pay for that. That's not, we don't have any staff through the house. It's just me answering emails. And so it is quite difficult with the number of emails that we get to do the legislation, to write speeches, and to answer every single email that we get. So if there's one thing I'd change would be to, and I don't know how you do this, to share a member of staff, because we all think quite different things about things, but to have a different office setup would be really, because the world has changed as well. Sure. One of the things, the Lords is trying to put in younger peers. And I went there when my daughter was 6, and it was really difficult being a mum of a 6-year-old, with either being away all week or sometimes having to bring her into the building. I mean, the poor thing sat through hours of the welfare reform bill in the back of the chamber. And I remember one day people going, oh my God, there's a child in the chamber. I was watching the discussion on social media and it was like, yep, that's my child. And she's been, we have an amazing set of staff who are incredibly trustworthy and wonderful, and when there's been a division because you can't take a child through the lobby, where I've just said, to one of the doorkeepers, Caris is going to sit there, can you keep an eye on it? I mean, that's not a modern way of working. And, the maternity bill that we've done recently, this should be a real shock to people on the outside. And I didn't realise until it came to us. As a female minister, if you want to take maternity leave, you have to resign. Yeah. There's no mat leave provision for, and there's lots of issues with maternity, adoption leave, all sorts of parental leave. But, we need to be sorting ourselves out and sorting out lots of things for women in the outside world as well. But you know, it's things like this are just crazy, you know, just crazy.
Just on the wider role of the House of Lords, I mean, you start to discuss the aspects of it that need to reform, and there's a whole litany of things we can do to make elected politics or representation in the House of Lords more accessible to women as well as underrepresented groups.
Yep.
You'll also be acutely aware there are lots of people across the country who want to abolish the House of Lords. You mentioned that your husband might be one of those people. Yep. But hearing you talk about the role of crossbench peers and the very unique expertise that they can bring, and you're a great example of that, but there are also so many other academics and security experts that come with a real niche perspective. Another one that strikes me is Doreen Lawrence, for example, who can talk with great authority about justice issues. Do you think there's a way of reforming the Lords that can keep some of that uniqueness that you get that's separate from a party political system, whilst also addressing the lack of democratic legitimacy that upsets so many people?
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think it's really important that we constantly look at that because, you know, again, the world's moved on. I think for me, who's got a lot of views on politics, I would have struggled to go into an environment like the Commons in terms of just how shouty it can be. And there are moments when it's not, but that's not an environment I would necessarily, even with all my toughness and resilience from sport, that's not an environment I think that I would be necessarily comfortable in. I think in the Lords, we're really clear what our role is. Our role is not to run the country. It's absolutely not. Our role is to be a check and balance on government and to say to the government of the day, are you really sure this is what you want to do? So depending which end legislation starts, but, you know, if it starts around, we get a bill, you know, we're there to say to the government, have another think about this. So there's some things we can send back 3 times, there's some things we can send back till we're bored. And I don't mean to be disrespectful in the way I say that, but, you know, we are there to say to the government, you can do better. I think, you know, there's been lots of talk about, you know, moving us to a Senate, and if that happens, us potentially having a bigger constituency size than an MP would currently have. I think you've got to think quite carefully, not about us being a Senate, but if, say, I stood as a senator and got in and I had a bigger constituency than an MP, I'd kind of want to run the country.
Yeah.
And I think you have to look at other jurisdictions, you know, where if you've got the same party that runs both chambers, either a lot gets through, or if you've got you know, 2 chambers where there's opposite parties, nothing gets through. And I think by and large with the system we have, that, you know, the government has the opportunity to get lots of its ideas through, which I think, you know, if people vote for I mean, I think there's all sorts of things that feed into this in terms of, you know, should we have first past the post? You know, constituency sizes, there's lots of things that feed into that. I genuinely worry about young people not voting and feeling disengaged from politics. So I think we have to keep looking at ourselves and checking whether we are doing things in the right way. There's also things in terms of how we operate. You know, we don't have mat leave. We don't get paid properly. You know,
I think we can all agree that democratic reform is a much bigger issue than just what happens to the House of Lords, and the points there about the degree to which you engage young people are critical to that. Why do you have to vote in the polling station nearest to your house? You know, it's 2021, for goodness sake. There's all sorts of different things we can do.
Yeah.
I had one question here, and before I want to talk to you specifically about your duty of care report, which I find absolutely fascinating, but a question here about whether you feel accountable as a member of the House of Lords and who you feel accountable to.
There's a couple of different levels to that. So I feel accountable to the people who agreed my appointment, so not to them as individuals, because the Public Appointments Commission changes, but I feel a responsibility to the people who thought I could do this job. And there are times when you think, this is quite hard, you know, or the times where you think, can I do this? And you have to remember that this sort of group decided that I was up for it. So I feel a responsibility to the reputation of the House of Lords, and I feel a responsibility to me that that I do the right thing, that I vote and I say the things that I believe in. Although, you know, it's sometimes hard, and also I feel really strongly about how I vote. So if I can't answer in 5 sentences or so how I voted or why I voted a certain way, I shouldn't vote. And there are things where it's so difficult to tell the difference between this and this, you know, so I do try hard to vote on everything. There are votes that I've abstained on, but I think that what's really interesting is very few people ask me why I vote on a certain topic a certain way, which I always expect people to do. I think if
it's
people
important to you to have that answer if you were asked for your own head.
Yeah, so when I'm going in, so we don't always know there's a vote coming up, but we've got like 8 minutes to be in the chamber, and then you've got a bit longer to decide. I always think in my head, so both my parents are died now, but I always think, right, if my mum said to me, Tanni, why did you vote that way? I have the answer in my head. And I think that's important to know why you're voting, not just to go down a corridor because you see someone else going down a corridor, or because you've been told to, or, you know. And that's the other thing with the Lords, you know, they're whipped in the Lords, but also, you know, there's some things that I've taken divisions on with benefits for disabled children, where there are people who will never vote with me, but there's a few people I've persuaded to go and have a cup of tea and abstain. And go, do you know what?
Yeah,
that is the best I'm going to get out of this. Yeah. So I do feel this responsibility. It's just not to a party or a whip, or to, you know, to in the way that people might expect. And I'll be really honest, the vast majority, the absolute massive majority of peers that I work with feel that sense of responsibility, because every decision we take can affect hundreds of thousands of people's lives, for good or bad. Yeah. So we're kind of really, I don't think we're good at maybe explaining that to the outside world, but we do feel that responsibility.
Let's talk for a bit about the intersection between sport and politics, because it's not an automatic one to people unless they sit down and really think about it. But your duty of care report, which I think you were asked to undertake by the UK government, was it David Cameron at the time? Was he the Prime Minister?
It was Tracy Crouch, as Sports Minister, asked me to do it.
So that covers such a broad range of issues, which are great examples of where sport and politics meet. So the experience of young people growing up in an elite sport environment, the degree to which they're exposed to abuse. We see lots of these stories in our newspapers just now around, for example, the role of abuse in gymnastics, the role of racial discrimination in football. And the report that you ended up producing also looks really closely at things like mental health around, I guess, failure or deselection in sport and how people are supported through that. You also look at what happens when athletes retire, often at a very young age, and how prepared they are to go back to civil life in a way that we might talk about in the context of the armed forces. And you also look at the degree to which groups are underrepresented in the hierarchies of sport, and particularly Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities. There's so many different political issues within that. I wonder if you can talk to us about how you were approached to do that work and how you set about doing it, and whether you think it's made the impact you hoped it would have at the time.
I was smiling at the beginning of your question, because there's all these people that keep saying sport and politics, you know, are not connected. You go, oh, they so are. We have a medal table, which countries, you know, view their soft power based on the medal table. You know, the games have been used, you know, to boycott, you know, through the Cold War. You know, there's been lots of ways that sport and politics interact. And I think we should actually just be really open and be a bit straighter about that in terms of the interaction. I think I'm quite lucky. So coming from a sports background into politics has been, because generally there's lots of decent people in sport, but there's a lot of really decent people in politics. So I don't think, for me as an individual, it was as big a transition as it maybe looked from the outside. So Tracy, as sports minister, had done a new sports strategy that was the first in 13 years. And out of that came a recommendation that duty of care need to be looked at. And I have lots of views on duty of care. And so she took me for a cup of tea and said, would you like to do it? And I went, yeah, I'd love to do it. Yeah. And it was a massive piece of work in terms of what I was asked to look at, because I was also asked to look at doping, anti-doping, gambling, huge sort of areas. What was interesting with it was that people were really, really open with me about what they thought was good in the system, and organisations and individuals were really open about what they thought needed to improve. What was a challenge was that a number of people were scared to have a public view. And I did have individuals say to me, you know, who's got access to your diary? I don't want my name being in your diary. Okay, and there were people who didn't want to come to Parliament to meet me because they didn't want to be seen coming into Parliament and have to tell anyone why they were coming in. So there were also a lot of people who felt that there is no issue in duty care in sport. And then, you know, the historic football abuses cases came out, and, you know, it's stuff that lots of people knew happened, but unless people are able to speak out publicly and have their name attached to it, it's really difficult to prove some of this stuff. So there were a number of things that happened through my time working on, and I still work on it, that have people have been really kind and helpful. The measuring the impact is quite difficult because some sports excuse me, thought they were brilliant and they weren't, and some were better than they thought. And even within a sport, there are pockets of really good practice and really not good practice. But I think we have to have these conversations. And, you know, the drive to win medals and 2012 brought a set of behaviours which are in conflict with duty of care. And then to announce we're going to be the first country excuse me, to bounce back after home games deepens those pressures. So yeah, nobody wants to, I think, return to a world where, you know, of Atlanta, when the Olympic team won a single gold. Most people actually forget the Paralympic team did quite well in Atlanta. Excuse me. But how many medals is enough? Yeah. How many medals do we need to win? And what is the price for those medals? There is a price to be paid. Are we willing to pay it? And we don't have those kind of detailed conversations. So I'm going to stop.
Give you a chance to have a drink there. I was just reflecting earlier, Tanni, that, you know, you were a household name in the 80s and 90s when I was growing up, and there was a lot of pressure associated with that, but there wasn't the internet or social media in the way that so many young athletes are faced with now. And I wonder if you think the pressures or the duty of care are perhaps even greater now and are growing as the years go by than they were when you were coming of age through sport.
Yeah, because, you know, when I was through most of my life in sport, we didn't receive funding of, you know, we didn't. And so there was an internal pressure to win medals, and there was sort of a pressure from the sport, but not in the same way. Now, medals and funding are so inextricably linked that it's very difficult to separate the two, because if you don't hit your medal target and you don't win gold medals, you don't get funding in the next cycle, which then affects everything else. So I think we need to have an element of pressure to win medals, but it's where's that line in the sand? And it comes back to what price are we willing to pay? You know, oh, do you want to start children doing elite sport at the age of 3? Do you want to take them out of school at 11? You know, how far do you want to go? Do you want to, you know, other countries like Norway have very strict rules on what age you're allowed to compete internationally, and they measure things in terms of fun and long-term inclusion in physical activity, where in this country, and I think this is where we can improve, you know, we have these arbitrary cut-off ages for each squad, and then whether they stay in the sport is not particularly measured. So I think, you know, I don't want to go to the Norway model, but I think we can move, because we also need to be thinking about long-term physical activity and the health of a nation, especially in the middle of a pandemic. So and it might not be a massive discussion, but I think those are some of the challenges about what is the price and is it worth paying, is that kind of conversation that we have. Because, you know, elite sport's not balanced. It's not, you know, it's a moment in time, but very few athletes get to achieve the you know, their goals and dreams. And I was one of the lucky ones, you know, incredibly lucky. But if you're told at the age of 11 that you're off a squad and you're no good, and, you know, that can affect you for the rest of your life. So it's how, there's so much in this, how you're told, the way you're done, how you're included. I think, and it's not massive changes, but I think there are things that we could do in a better way. And, you know, when I did the piece of work, I had an Olympic gold medalist who's made enough money to never work again sit with me over a cup of tea and cry and say, I'm not good at anything. but to the outside world, this individual would be deemed, highly successful, well, would have everything they could have ever wanted, and they didn't. And that's not a one-off. That is absolutely not. You're a long time out of sport. And the other thing with elite sport, if you're successful in elite sport, it's, you get to go to lots of nice things, and you're the athlete, and but that's not the real world. So how we help children of all ages transition out of sport into life outside this elite pathway is really important. So it's ongoing. I mean, one of the things I'm working on at the moment is positions of trust, which is unbelievable that it doesn't cover sport. So for a lot of good reasons, it's illegal for a teacher to be in a sexual relationship with a 16 to 18-year-old. Yeah, that doesn't cover sport. So it is entirely legal for a coach to be in a sexual relationship with a 17-year-old that they coach. And to me, yeah, and you're like that, you do not understand the position of power that exists within sport. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. I'm trying to change the legislation with Sarah Champion, Tracy Crouch. There's a number of us that are working on it to say, look, it doesn't protect older abuse of power, but we've got to at least protect the 16 to 18-year-olds. We have to.
So there are lots of questions coming in now, particularly about COVID and the impact that's having on people with disabilities that I'd like to get to in our final 20 minutes. But I've just got one more question on sport, Tanni, if you'll humour me. We've talked a lot there about talent in sport and what happens when you maybe don't achieve to the level that you might have expected to. But what we haven't done there is talk about some of the institutional barriers that stop talent rising through. So there are still lots of sports which are considered elite on the basis of social class, and a lot of sports that are still very white and lack the diversity that we would expect. Have you got any views on how you change that? Is it investment in local facilities and project workers? What is there one missing piece? I know austerity doesn't help it, but surely throwing money at it alone isn't the only answer to the dynamic.
Money can help, but it's about attitude as well. So if you look at governing bodies in sport, and do they have diverse boards? No. I remember years ago there was one sport that decided they were going to put a woman on the board, and somebody came to speak to me and they said, we're going to have a woman. And at that point, the way they said that was like, this is not going anywhere. And then this individual said to me, and they can only talk about women's issues. Isn't that the whole of the sport? I'm like, no, women's issues. So I'm afraid I did talk about periods in front of this chap. I went, oh my God, that's anyway, I didn't get it. So, but there is not enough. So that's one part of it. And sports, we'll do it next time, next appointment. Like, just stop it. Just change that. So I've been talking about diversity on boards for 30 years, and it's not moved quick enough. So my view is just, change it. But it's through the organisation. There are sports where, there aren't any elite female coaches on the senior team, and then you actually need to understand why. And it's because it's the way the coaching courses are run. It's the way that women perceive themselves. It's the way that, I could go into all the explanation of why. My frustration is that this is not unknown. We know why there is not diversity. It just needs to change. And then in a lot of sports, they are not diverse at all. And I think each of the governing bodies need to just, go out and look for people, offer opportunity. Also, the other side with, if you don't see people that look like you, then you don't necessarily think that sport is for you. So I think you've got to be quite careful in terms of making people like poster children, because they've got to be quite comfortable in that role. And you can't just stick them on. So I see a lot of stuff where they put a wheelchair user on a poster and pretends inclusion's done. Like, that's just nonsense. So you've got to be careful that it's not tokenistic. But also, I think greater diversity shouldn't be spun off into a charity of the governing body, because that makes it charitable. I'm quite uncomfortable with that. So, I think sports do need to be measured on different bits of different sort of sections of diversity. So the other thing with elite sport now is that it's made the pathway really expensive. So, the average cost of being a pathway athlete can be, as a junior, as a 14-year-old, can be 10 grand a year. You know, lots of families don't have that as a disposable income. So I think we need to be looking at ways of making the pathway more accessible financially.
Okay.
And, you know, and also, I mean, but it goes on. So, you know, a lot of our medalists come from independent schools. That is not just because they may have more disposable income, because you can't assume that every child in an independent school has more disposable income. But they have properly trained PE teachers for the prep schools. So they're taught really good skills at a really young age. And we don't, so there's so many different levers that we need to pull, but we just need a government to say, come on, right, let's tackle, you know, you could tackle it quite quickly. It's just, it never quite gets to the top of the
needs to be the political will there to do that. We've got 15 minutes left, Tanni, so I think we need to talk about COVID. And I'm very conscious that you've spoken out publicly already this month about the impact that COVID is having on people with disabilities and their ability to access sport and fitness. Talk to us about what you see happening and perhaps how long-term you think that damage or that regression might be.
Well, the gap between disabled people being active and non-disabled people was already reasonably big. And it was starting very slowly to close. And then the pandemic has sort of, you know, widened that gap again. And that's in terms of access to spaces. And, you know, it's not as easy for a disabled person to go and be active outside. You know, pushing your chair is not the same as walking. It's less calories for one thing. And then, you know, safety and pavements and all, there's lots of things that impact that. I think there's also where we've got to is because of the view of Paralympics. And it's really difficult, it's my background, but I think it's much harder for a young disabled child to look at the Paralympics and either think that's what I want to be or to see or understand the pathway to it, because you have to travel quite a long way to maybe get competition, or you may be disabled and not in a classifiable event, or you might not be good enough and you might not want to train 12 times a week. So there's all these things that are the barriers. That the reality is Paralympics is for a relatively small group of people in terms of classifiable people. And I think where we are now is that it's very hard to be disabled and to be not very good at sport, right? Because the assumption is that you're going to be a Paralympian. So lots of young disabled children who just start off on the sports route, one of the first questions they'll be asked is, are you going to be a Paralympian? Well, we don't do that with non-disabled children. You don't say to a 12-year-old, no, like, you know, or you don't get complete strangers going up to a 12-year-old and saying, you can be a Olympian, sorry. But we get that with disabled children. So again, the other side of 2012 is that people assume the only thing a disabled person can do is be a Paralympian. It might change slightly now. The European Space Agency says they might send a disabled person up into space, but basically that's somebody with a fused ankle. They're not going to send a person like me into space. And
so should there be a right to recreational sport then? Is that where the focus should be?
Yeah, so disabled children in school need access to PE, and some places they get it and some they don't. We need to stop thinking about Paralympics. You know, that is an option for some, but we need to stop defining it in a really young age. Some of the language, I think, is not in the right place. So now there's been a move in the last couple of years to call any disabled person who does sport a para-athlete. So that could be a 12-year-old who plays a sport once a month, or it could be a Paralympian. And I think it conflates and confuses people if everyone is called para. You know, we don't call a non-disabled child who does a bit of sport an Olympic athlete or an Ollie athlete, because actually now Olympians are allowed to put OLY after their names. So I think it conflates it. I think it's just, it's easy to kind of go, oh, that's a disability. But, and lots of people have said to me, oh, we like the word para because I don't have to say disabled. It's like, just own it, you know. And there's lots of disabled people with different views of this. But, you know, I don't think we should be shying away from you know, the social model and the medical model of impairment and having conversations. So we basically, I said this in front of a select committee years ago, we need lots of disabled people who aren't very good at sport. We need to make that acceptable. And at the moment, I don't think we have that. I think we push young disabled children to be, you're a Paralympian or you're nothing. Yeah. And I don't think that's good enough, because actually it's really important that disabled people are fit and healthy.
It's like saying to a young kid, you either play for Man City or not at all. Like it's the wrong dimension.
Yeah.
What about the impact of COVID beyond sport then on people with disabilities? So I've been thinking a lot recently about, you know, what we've seen in the past year in terms of a Conservative government being prepared to use the power of the state to effect change. And suddenly everybody's thinking about things like, you know, isolation payments and how they would cover their sick leave if they weren't getting it from their employers. Do you think there's any positivity in that around how attitudes towards welfare reform might change in the future, because people might have a better sense of kind of society? Or am I being far too optimistic and quite the opposite's going to happen, and attitudes towards the state and its role in our lives and the safety net that we should all have are going to regress?
Yeah, so by now I would have expected a welfare reform bill, another one, and certainly a piece of legislation that allowed us to look at universal credit. And, you know, lots of people supported, you know, it was universally accepted that universal credit was a good idea in the Lords Chamber. The rollout of it has been quite challenging and difficult, and the devil is always in the detail. But two things have stopped the major legislation that we're working on is Brexit, which just sucked up all the political air, and then the pandemic. So, you know, at some point we need to be looking at legislation that covers that. But I think what has been fascinating with the pandemic, you know, disabled people and women and lots of people have been arguing for years about flexible working, doing differently, working from home. It's all too difficult. And then the pandemic happens, and we figured out we can do it. And we don't have to be in the same room. And there's stuff that I miss about being in the same room, absolutely. But we can do things in a different way. So I think for some disabled people that brings some benefits. But also I think with the shielding, and now somewhere between another 1.5 million and 2 million disabled people have recently had letters to say they have to shield where they didn't before. I think a lot of disabled people are worried they're going to be not seen in society. And it's going to go back to the days of the 70s where disabled people were locked away and we didn't see them. You know, growing up, the only two people that I saw for quite a long period of time weren't even disabled. They were Sandy Richardson on Crossroads and Ironside on TV. So I think a lot of us are worried about slipping back to those days. Then when you add in the compulsory do not resuscitate orders that were placed on thousands of disabled people without asking them, with no underlying health conditions, which sent out the message, you don't even get the right to fight for a ventilator. You won't be taken into hospital.
How did that happen?
How did it happen?
Yeah, how can that happen? How does the system allow that to happen?
So I think people were doing it for the right reason. I think it was in that at the start of the pandemic, the numbers, and the NHS was swamped. I think the number of people they were expecting to be coming in, they thought they were doing the right thing by making decisions pre-admittance to help doctors who are working on a COVID ward to make decisions about who got a ventilator. So I think there was intention there that could make sense. I think what happened when it was just applied to lots of disabled people, it was like, we have no value in society. And lots of people feel like that anyway, where this was just another thing on top of, you know, the employment gap for disabled people is twice the national average. The unemployment gap, you know, it's just layer on layer on layer. And so, yeah, there was massive pushback on that. But then you look at the figures that 60% of people who died for COVID are disabled. And, you know, the figures from ONS came out recently, and lots of people running around going, oh, this is awful. Those figures were available last year, but there wasn't a lot of pickup from it. And so we do need to talk about the intersectionality of that, because that's really important. But you know, again, it's layer on layer. So it's all that sort of stuff that made disabled people feel not welcomed in society. And again, the bit that you're a Paralympian or you're nothing, it's the haves and have-nots. Or, you know, certainly around the last welfare reform debate and since, it's almost you're getting to deserving and undeserving poor. Yeah. And the DNR was definitely deserving and undeserving disabled people. And, you know, they're you can just discount them. Yeah. And that was really worrying for me. And still, what's been helpful is you kind of knew that existed, but it was helpful to see it played out in such a way where you could go, that is what I'm talking about. Because, you know, I didn't realise until the third lockdown, I guess, how much resilience I need as a disabled person to live my life, because I'm quite thick-skinned. I'm used to discrimination. You just bat it away. You know, another person's talked down to me. Another person's tried to help me put my coat on when I didn't ask for help. You know, someone's tried to help me in my car, and you think, oh, they're trying to do the right thing. I think what third lockdown did for me was like, do you know what? I'm tired of being treated like I'm 4, you know, and something happened to me last summer where we were allowed out. I was at an event, and somebody came over to me and twice offered to help me. And I very politely both times said, no, I don't need it. And then they tried to help me. And I just said to them, actually, this is an accessibility issue. And I was like, I need access, not help. And they, oh my God, they took their bat and ball home with me. I was trying to help you. You know, I don't know. Like, I didn't want your help. I told you 3 times I didn't want your help. And you still decided I didn't have the mental capacity to know whether I needed help or not. Go away. I mean, I didn't say that to them, but quite that
you're being perfectly entitled.
I scowled at them, and I wrote an email afterwards. I've turned into my dad. But it was just like, what gives you the right to think I have no, and actually, whether you thought I was struggling or not, that's still not your right to make a decision for me. So that's daily life for me, but that's daily life and worse for loads of disabled people. And you know what? We need to stop. We live in an ableist and paternalistic society, and the pandemic has highlighted that in a really strong way. So whereas previously I'd be, okay, let's have a conversation. I'm a little bit more feisty about it these days, because I haven't got time to sit around and wait for society to change. I'm going to start calling people out, and still with a level of respect and politeness. But you know what? Just stop treating disabled people as if they can't make decisions.
Tanni, we too are running out of time. I've got 2 questions here left. I don't know if I'll get through both of them, but I'm definitely going to try one of them, because we do need to stop on the hour. Otherwise, we can't call it a power hour. So I'm going to read it out very specifically. It's from a guy called Jamie, and he says, the recent COVID vaccination programme has brought the needs of people with learning disabilities into sharp focus. Is the disability rights movement failing people with learning disabilities by not giving them platforms in sport, politics and media to speak for themselves?
We do need to have people with learning disabilities able to speak and be the people interviewed in and be at the heart of it. I think we've got disabled people's organisations, and we've got organisations that are run for disabled people, and they're quite different. I think one of the issues we've got is because disabilities are all put in together, and we're not one homogenous group. So I think it's true that, you know, we just don't hear the voices of disabled people in the places that we should. You know, I get phone calls saying, can you come and talk about this because you're disabled? Go, I know nothing about it. Yeah, but you said, yeah, but I still know nothing about it. So what I try and do is connect people to other disabled voices, but we have to be better and stop talking to and putting platforming people who talk for disabled people as opposed to disabled people speaking for themselves.
That's a really powerful point to end on. Tanni, that has been an absolutely fascinating hour. I feel like we've whizzed through so many different issues there, and we could have done a lot more. We could have talked about the recent Westminster Select Committee report on the Equality Act and what that might mean in the future. So we may have to do this all over again, but I can't thank you enough for your time. That's truly been just a fantastic hour in your company. And to the people who are watching this, if I can say to them, if you enjoyed that, Power Hours are back on the 9th of March with David Lammy, the Labour MP for Tottenham. We'll be exploring his role fighting for justice for the victims of Grenfell, and separately the Windrush generation. We'll also be discussing his book Tribes, which is about the politics of identity, and you can register for that event on our website at the moment. If you'd like to shape who we hear from next in the Power Hour series, then please complete the super quick evaluation form, which is about to appear on your screen and in your inboxes tomorrow. The feedback we get from these events is always so positive, and it's a really nice thing to be able to share with our guests as just another way of thanking them for their time. So all that's left for me to say is to say thank you once again to Tanni, and wish you all a very good afternoon. Bye for now.